Good morning and welcome to this very interesting panel discussion called Marketing and Communication of Sustainability in Sports. We have two really fantastic panelists today, and let me introduce them. Our first panelist is Miss Josie Traberg, a PhD scholar at Norwegian School of Sports Science, where she is researching environmental sustainability signaling in sport organizations. She holds 2 master's degrees and works as a strength coach. Ms. Traberg, welcome. Our second panelist, Our second panelist is Dr. Michael Anagnostou, a sports management lecturer at Loughborough University and the former CEO of Super League, who has also worked for FIFA, UEFA, Athens 2004 Olympic Games, and more. Dr. Anagnostou holds a PhD in sports science and physical education, an MSc in sports and recreational management, and a bachelor's degree in sports science and physical education. Dr. Anagnostou, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you today.
So the topic today is really important. We had, for those who attended the previous presentation as well, of sustainability and some myths. So the marketing and communication of sustainability, how we market that. What are your initial thoughts on this topic?
Would you like me to start or?
Yeah, yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I think we should set up the scene first and have a look at the context of environmental sustainability in sports. Let's accept that there is a real problem there, because it's very important for people who work in sports to understand that there is a real problem. And although people started to understand lately, the truth is that it's not something imminent, it's not something urgent for many of the people who work in sport. Now, the current situation in the planet, I know that we are all aware here, but it's good to stress that climate change is one of the biggest challenges faced by modern society, right? And the effects of climate change, from rising temperatures, rising sea levels, floods, droughts, and fires, threaten really the lives and health of people across the planet. For example, where I live in the UK, recently in London, London recorded the highest temperature in its history, with a thermometer exceeding 40 degrees. The recent heat wave in England has led rail companies to change their timetables and reduce their train speeds due to the risk of a heat wave distortion. In sports now, the sports industry contributes to the environmental degradation, for example, through the sports events, the construction, the maintenance of sports facilities, and the movement of athletes, of the fans, and the movement and the transportation of other participants in sports activities. So the increasing environmental awareness of the public has become so important that it cannot be ignored by the organizers of the sports events and the sports governing bodies. Environmental and concerns of sport consumers, of sports fans, ought to be catered, and the event organizers should keep up with the current trends to ensure that sustainability exists within sport. So I think this would be a good start to understand there is a real problem, and that people working in sport should understand that.
Definitely, I can only agree with that. So, Ms. Traberg, you have done a lot of research around environmental sustainability in sports as well. What are your thoughts on what Dr. Anagnostou just said?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I really do appreciate, first of all, you just laying out like the land of where we are in terms of sustainability in sport. Indeed, it is climate vulnerability that you mentioned is really showing up in sport. And already this summer there have been talks about and concerns for that there will probably be an increasing number of deaths related to or happening as a result of sport competitions in extreme weather, such as heat and so forth. So if we look at the status from that perspective and of climate vulnerability, then sport is going to be facing this and be struggling with this in the same way as all other sectors of society. But it also means that we need to be contributing to reverse this or halt this in the same way. Now, when we look at the question that you started with, Marcus, it was, where are we? Or where is sport? My way to answer that is that we are, obviously sport has an undiscussable responsibility, and that undiscussable responsibility comes from sport's global reach, right? So considering that sport is in some way engaging, affecting, contributing to the lives of people all over the world, there's no reason for sport not to be doing something here. Now, if we ask the question then of what are we doing or where are we in sport, my answer to that through research and of course knowing what's happening in the sports world is we are in our infancy, or we're in this toddler stage. And so the question of then where are we or what are we doing, the answer unfortunately is not enough. We're trying, we're a toddler or a baby who's trying to learn how to walk. But there definitely has to be lots to be done still. And that does start with the communication, of course, as well, of how is this sustainability being marketed and communicated through sports. And that's not just about, are we good at marketing and communicating it, but what is actually happening behind this marketing and the marketing strategies.
So whose responsibility is this? I mean, we have so many stakeholders in sports. We have mega events, we have teams, we have individual players. I assume that, everyone has to take their responsibility, but you said we are in our infancy. So how do we start? How do we go from here?
That's a really great question. Considering that I use the terminology infancy, I typically use that when looking at what are different of the bigger scale sports clubs doing. So that could be looking at, for instance, the UEFA, or what are Premier League clubs doing? What are the bigger international sport organizations doing that already can put a lot of pressure on sports club at the higher levels? What are teams in perhaps the NBA doing, the NFL, the NHL, and so forth? So the responsibility then comes on the organizations that are already attracting a big group of stakeholders, lots of fans, and so forth. And that responsibility has to start there, considering that we look at their leverage, their ability to communicate and reach lots of fans, reach lots of stakeholders.
Dr. Anagnostou, you have worked for several large organizations in sports. So how do you see the responsibility for these big players?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that sustainability in sports has a long history. Of course, it is a trend recently, but the whole story, the history of the environmental interest in sports is a bit old. Dates back to the run-up of the 1932 Winter Olympics. Of course, we don't remember, we were not even born. But what happened there, non-governmental organizations expressed their concern over the sensitivity of local ecosystems. And this led to facilities being built away from protected sites, for example. And after the 1992 Winter Olympic Games in Albertville in France, where France had left a devastating impact on the environment, and heavily forested areas and their wildlife, they were destroyed, and in order to make room for new sports infrastructure. So after that, the IOC committed to review its policy in relation to the natural environment and in cooperation with the organizing committees of the Winter Olympics in Norway. And as a result, this led to the Treaty of Rio in 1992. And after that, other initiatives, like in 1994, the environment was recognized as the third pillar of Olympism. And then the evolution of environmental sustainability was reflected in the agenda of IOC, of the International Olympic Committee, in 2020, which actually is a guide for the future of the Olympic movement. So there is a history there on behalf of the sport. And of course, we see in the last decade that UEFA, FIFA, other governmental bodies, clubs, big clubs and leagues, Ajax, for example, or Real Betis, or other examples, bright examples like Forest Green in England, they take initiatives and they do the right thing. So there is a response, but this response is not embedded yet. We could say that this is in the level 1 of the 3 waves model in environmental sustainability. We would say that most of the clubs are just aware and they try to do some things here and there, but not really not really impact the lives of people and their fans.
Very interesting. And on that topic, we have gotten a question in the chat here. So the question states that Dr. Anagnostou rightly states that sports organizations must acknowledge that there is a problem. They must understand it. How can we help them understand that there is a problem, and maybe give 2 examples of how this can be done?
Would you like me to answer? Sorry.
Yes, it was a question for you in the chat.
Sorry. Yes. Listen, there are many initiatives, and we just have to follow the guidelines and the policies of big organizations. So, for example, there is the Sports for Climate Action. There is the Paris Agreement. There is mainly the Sports for Climate Action is based on 5 pillars, and where participants in this initiative have committed to implement. So the 5 main principles of Sports for Climate Action of the United Nations is the promotion of greater environmental responsibility. First of all, the promotion, the reduction of the overall climate impact of sport. Also, the education for climate action, the promotion of sustainable and responsible consumption, the support of activities and action for the climate. So all these things, if sports organizations follow the directives of the United Nations and the Sports for Climate Action, yes, we can have an impact.
And I'd like to add to that, yes, if you guys don't mind. Now, it's, of course, we're at a great start if we look at the Sport for Climate Action framework by the United Nations, or we look at the Sport for Nature framework as well. And we could talk endlessly about frameworks or directives or suggestions or proposals of how sport organizations and clubs should become and should work in sustainable ways to really take care of the environment. Now, but there's a difference in making recommendations and then actually following up on those recommendations, and eventually then also measuring what has been done. So unfortunately, we're at this stage now where, and as Michael mentioned as well, where yes, clubs and organizations are in wave 1 of, if we look to the McCullough framework, of what the waves of adapting sustainability look like. We're in this wave 1 where we're kind of reaching for the low-hanging fruits. We, or sport organizations really aim to do the things that are easy to grasp and adapt, and that can kind of give a show or embellishment of green, that there's something sustainable happen. But then there's no necessarily follow-up, or there's no ways to measure what has been done. So while the Sport for Climate Action Framework is wonderful as a starting point, and it's great that there are so many signatories now from all over the world, big sport organizations included, it is unfortunately at this point, now this will be changed in the future and I'll get back to that, but unfortunately there are very little follow-up or ways to measure what the sustainability or the initiatives and implementations look like. Now, of course, we are looking into the future and of course to 2030 and then onwards, where there will be bigger expectations of organizations, specifically in the Sport for Nature, Sport for Climate Action Framework, that they will actually start reporting and actually measure what their initiatives look like. But right now, because we're in this low-hanging fruit stage, which is the wave 1 in the typology, unfortunately, there's an implementation of initiatives, but there's really no follow-up.
So there was a question also in the chat for Ms. Traberg. So talking about that follow-up and maybe implementing some rules, Where do we draw the line between general efforts and greenwashing? Should there be some rules in regards to terminology, for example, carbon positive?
Very, very good question. So first of all, I'm actually really curious to see what this will look like, specifically in the European Union now in the next year to 2 to 3. Right now, it's looking like there will be passed a EU greenwashing ban, so regulative. Hopefully that will come into law in 2025. Now, with that in law, there will be very strict and very specific regulatives to what can and cannot be communicated in terms of, like you say, carbon positive or climate neutral or climate zero, using those words, which are typically related then to greenwashing. But we're not there yet to where things have been put in law and where you're legally not allowed to communicate in a certain way. So until then, I believe to minimize this spread or trend, if you will, of greenwashing in sport organizations, there needs to be more specific and clearer guidelines as to what is greenwashing in terms of communication and what's not. And that actually starts with our sport organizations kind of checking in with themselves in terms of what can we communicate or what should we communicate based on, of course, asking the question of where are we in our sustainability journey and how do we remain transparent? Now, it's one thing to talk about that we're on this journey, which a lot of sport organizations do, and that it is a journey, the sustainability shift. But most importantly is being honest about where you are on your sustainability journey. And I think that honesty or transparency is going to really help minimize greenwashing cases. So going back to then this example of, we talk about being climate positive, meaning an organization claims to be fighting for the climate or being climate neutral. Those are very big statements, but they're also statements that mean very little, because really, what does climate positive mean? So eliminating language like that in the first place, eliminating the words such as green or pro-enviro or pro-planet and planet positive, that's a good starting point, really, because there is no way of measuring that. I'm going back to my case of measurement. And in that sense, we're hopefully going to be one step closer to minimizing these greenwashing attempts.
One more question from the audience to Ms. Traberg. The chat is really on fire here. It's obviously a topic that interests the audience, which is great. So you mentioned measuring now in the end. How should we measure progress? Is it based on GHG emissions? Is it CO2? Should we develop more qualitative indicators to capture real progress, or how will we measure?
That's a really good question. And it's also, I think, where a lot of people working in the industry, of course, organizations, but also consultants and so forth, where they're kind of now banging their head against the wall, is that how do we measure and what does this measurement look like? Should there be a standardized way of measuring for all organizations? I can get back to that later if that's the yes or no, but there definitely needs to be a mix, is my answer. And that's what I'm looking at through my research as well. Is, of course, we do need the standardized quantitative measurements, such as how are we measuring GHG emissions? What is accounted for and what's not? Because quite honestly, if we are looking at that, then it needs to be everything needs to be accounted for. Also, what's happening in your supply chain? What are how are your vendors transporting things, et cetera, right? So that needs to be quantitative in terms of how things are measured, but also perhaps qualitative in terms of what are stakeholders experiencing. Are they starting to perceive your brand or your organization as more sustainable, really because of how you're communicating to the public? So the answer there is yes, it's both quantitative and qualitative measurements. Of course, emphasis on the quantitative, because we do need specific numbers here, and we do need to measure what CO2 emissions and GHG emissions look like.
Interesting. So Dr. Anagnostou, you have also, of course, both worked and made a lot of research in this area. So what's your thoughts on this?
Well, actually, I would like to stress the importance of the real and active examples. I think we all need to do some benchmarking and see what real life can offer to us. For example, there are bright examples, as I said before, like Forest Green Rovers, and which is the most active, we would say, team in environmental issues by far. And the actions of this team, for example, they try to meet their energy needs from 100% renewable resources and produced by solar panels located in the roof of their new stadium, or the football pitch is 100% organic, where no pesticides are used. The lawn is mown by solar-powered lawn mower and irrigated with rainwater. Collected at the team's facilities. Electric vehicles are used and charged, and charging stations are provided. And fans are encouraged to use sustainable means of transportation. We can see, and we must see all these examples actually, and try to do the right thing, and then start to implement all these activities that we can plan in a brand strategy. Because we came here to talk about the market and the communication side of environmental sustainability in sports as well. And I think all of the organization, all the executives, all people who work, they should try to embed and implement a brand strategy with environmental sustainability, one of the main pillars. So if there are 3, 4, 5 pillars in the communication, that's the right thing to do. And the best communication to do is to do the right thing. Actually, if you do the right thing, this is the best way of communicating with your audience. So we have to see the specificities of sports and in marketing, and then to start to implement a brand management program surrounding our organization with environmental sustainability and sensitivity. And there are specific ways to do that and specific tools. Anything can be marketed. Even an idea can be marketed because marketing happens and communication for sports, but it also happens and takes place through sports. And we have to realize the new marketing realities, which is technology, globalization, social responsibility. And within this context, to see our brand strategy of our organization. There are new capabilities out there because of technology, like the internet, the mobile marketing, but there are also new capabilities for the fans to demand these new, let's say, offerings. And of course, we have to understand that the sports market is different. The communication is different in sports. We cannot control 100% our product, but there are specific fan connection touch points, like the star power, top players, like the family, like the socialization, like the local community, the participation in sports. And we have to take these advantages. We have to take advantage of these elements so that to promote our communication around sustainability.
So that's a very good point that you bring up with the different generations also. So of course, the younger generation coming up they are more eager to solve this issue and talk about the environmental sustainability. And of course, it's the older generation who is mostly in power. So as you said, like how can the fans put pressure on teams, on organizations to create change?
Fans already demand this. Fans already are aware, and they would compromise, as we heard before, Elizabeth, that they're ready to sacrifice actually many things in order to have some sustainable policy from their club, from the club that they support. But the clubs, and that's what we realized. We did the research in Greece and in Greek football in specific. Although the clubs are aware, they don't feel any real pressure from the governing bodies to do that, to do the right thing. And that's something that should concern us. The directives reach our top governing bodies, but they are not disseminated to the middle and lower, let's say, level of sports. And that's where we have to intervene, like experts, like institutions, to put under pressure, we would say, to push these initiatives. With conferences like that, with articles in the newspapers, going out and talk to the public and make people understand their responsibilities and include these strategies, environmental sustainability strategies, within their brand management strategies.
Yeah, so on that topic, a question for Ms. Traberg from the audience. Is it enough with fan pressure and self-assessment, or is external bodies needed for measurement and eventually certification?
That's a really good question. Definitely fan pressures and expectations from fans is not enough. And of course, it is wonderful that we are getting a consumer body and fan body that is becoming more aware, and also recognizing that their consumer power and their buying power can impact this matter, and help create the sustainability shift. But it shouldn't just be on fans and stakeholders to put these pressures on. So indeed, certification schemes or expectations put through certifications through different regulatives are super important, I believe. Unfortunately, this where we're at in creating the sustainability shift, there needs to be more regulatives. It's not enough, as I've mentioned previously, to just create recommendations or suggestions of where the sport industry should go. People work, unfortunately, best with, of course, there will be upheavals and frustrations, but change in this setting, because this is so critical, is going to work best by, unfortunately, having to place strict regulatives, new rules and policies and so forth, where we actually can force this change. And I'll give an example. So for instance, in Norway, they are now replacing all artificial turf used in football, specifically because we've seen that this turf is not very sustainable. There ends up being rubber granules floating everywhere in water and in snow, and really it's just becoming a major pollutant in society. So there has now been placed a regulative forcing all football pitches to have replaced this artificial turf by 2030. And indeed, this has been very much discussed and talked about, but research now also sees that there probably would never have been a change, and this artificial turf would have never been replaced if it wasn't for this being set in as a strict regulative and now a rule that has to be followed. So to then go back to the question, absolutely, governing bodies or anyone else who are sitting with this power and also who can sanction organizations who don't necessarily create the changes needed is definitely going to help in this process. But we also need to recognize that a lot of sport organizations, definitely smaller clubs, are not necessarily in a position where they can and have the means to, or the people to create the sustainability shift that we're looking at. And again, I'll give the example here of, for instance, Norwegian sports clubs, which is currently an area that I'm doing a little bit of research in. Norwegian sports clubs are also placed under, and now I'm talking specifically also the grassroots clubs. So sports clubs in Norway might serve in, and the same goes with the Scandinavia in general. So Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and so forth. These clubs they have a bigger expectations to serve in society and touch on many social aspects. So of course, inclusion of children and youth. 93% of kids in Norway are part of a sports club sometime in their life. That's quite big. That's a big number. So these sports clubs operate to serve a big social function in kids and youth lives, and of course in adults' lives as well. Everyone in some way or form here, it seems, has an engagement or is involved in a sports club. Now, these sports clubs are mainly concerned with just offering the number one activity that is sport. And for them to put expectations on them to now also manage and deal with environmental sustainability matters is rather challenging. Again, from a financial standpoint and from a resource standpoint. So we also need to recognize that placing regulatives and enforcements and laws can be very difficult for some organizations to meet based on, again, their resources and so forth. And therefore, there also needs to be funding schemes and support for organizations so they can actually make these sustainability transitions. So the answer here is yes, there absolutely needs to be more regulatives, there needs to be actually things put into law to create the sustainability shift we need. But to do that, there needs to also then be support so organizations actually can make this sustainability or environmental sustainability shift in a sustainable manner.
Would you allow me to intervene?
Of course.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And I would go even further. I think that now is the time for clubs to go into deeper waters, let's say, and to implement there. I have the courage to propose now. I will propose the environmental brand equity. And what is brand equity? It's the commercial added value that derives from the brand name in the consumer's minds. And we have to embed the environmental brand equity. And this happens through very simple and practical ways. They have to develop an awareness about environment, and also the right brand associations in consumers' minds, in the minds of the fans. And this can happen very easily by recognizing and identifying the right brand associations and then passing them in the brand of the organization through brand spillover effects, through co-branding, through techniques like through their websites, through their mobile applications, through their social media, through search engine optimizations, below the line communication, above the line, guerrilla marketing, anything. They can use the tools to embed the environmental brand equity in the minds of consumers. And there are people there to help them. We are here to help them. And they have to know that the brand story, the environmental brand story, should be the same in all of their channels. And I could give some examples, but maybe it's not the right time now. Like, green initiatives, sustainable practices in stadiums, merchandising, using sustainable materials, community engagement, partnerships with eco-friendly brands, etc., etc. So there are ways, there are specific tools to do that, and they just have to move on. Don't wait because I know that there are people from clubs now and sports organizations listening to us. Don't wait from FIFA or UEFA or the IOC to impose things. Go there because now there is a need and people want that. People demand that.
That's a fantastic final statement. We are actually a bit over time, so I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. It's obviously a topic that interests a lot of people, so happy that everyone tuned in. Thank you both, Dr. Anagnostou and Ms. Traberg, for your great contribution and for this great panel.
Thank you very much for the invitation.